We were established by the U.S. Congress in 1984 as a public, nonpartisan institute dedicated to helping prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflict abroad. On behalf of the United States Institute of Peace, we are delighted, very pleased to welcome all of you for a special fireside conversation on the Israel-Gaza conflict with Senator Tom Cotton and a member of the USIP board, Roger Zakheim. As many of you know, we have a Newsmaker series. This is when we invite distinguished members of Congress to speak with distinguished members of the Washington political class. In our case, we're lucky that the distinguished member of the Senate, Senator Cotton, and the distinguished member of the political class, Roger, is with us on the board. The aim of these series is to have a set of discussions where we express views on issues. We hope that these views are respected. We know that the most important thing in a democracy is that people feel that they can say what they want to say in the way that we want to say them, and this is an opportunity for that to happen here. It's my privilege to introduce our distinguished guest. Senator Cotton was elected as the senator from Arkansas in 2014 after 2 years of service in the House of Representatives. Senator Cotton is a decorated Iraq war veteran with 4 years of active service in the U.S. Army and 3 years of service in the Army Reserve. The senator serves on the Senate Judiciary, Intelligence, and Armed Services Committees and is the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Criminal Justice and Terrorism and the Subcommittee on Air Land. In these roles, Senator Cotton is a strong advocate for diplomacy, for international human rights, and the need for clear-eyed American leadership abroad. The senator has demonstrated commitment to peace, to partnership, and stability, and is one of our country's most trusted voices on foreign policy and national security issues. We are also pleased to welcome USIP board member Roger Zakheim, who will be moderating our fireside discussion. Roger currently serves as the Washington director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. He previously served as the Deputy Assistant of Defense and as the General Counsel and Deputy Staff Director of the U.S. House Armed Services Committee. In 2022, Roger was nominated by the President of the United States and confirmed by the Senate as a member of the board of USIP. Thank you all for being with us today. Roger, with your permission, we hand to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lise, for that kind introduction, and really an honor to have the opportunity to participate in this series, particularly with Senator Cotton, who will kick things off with some observations on the subject of tonight's discussion, and then I'll follow up with questions and discussion points for the balance of our time. Senator.
Well, thanks, Roger, for having me here, and thanks to the Institute of Peace. Lise, thank you very much for the kind introduction and for what you do here. It's true that we confirmed Roger to the position here on your board.
I knew this was coming. I knew, goodness.
Thus far, it doesn't seem to be cause for regret, although he has many years ahead of him for us to regret that decision. But Roger, thanks very much for your work, not just here with the Institute of Peace, but at the Reagan Foundation as well. You know, we're at the Institute of Peace, and peace is one of the highest goods in foreign policy. That's what most foreign policy, at least here in the United States, aims towards, and usually what we want to achieve. But we also see around the world, yet again, that peace does not seem to be the natural condition of mankind. Peace is not something that just flowers without being cultivated and preserved and actively sought. In fact, if you look across the sweep of history, it would seem that war is the natural condition of mankind, although perhaps paradoxically so, because it also seems that no particular war, big or small, is inevitable, even if war itself is inevitable. War typically occurs through the failure of leaders from various countries to actively cultivate and pursue peace, which takes an expenditure of effort and resources just as surely as it does to win a war, although much less expenditure of resources and time and effort. And whether you see the failure of deterrence in Ukraine almost 2 years ago now, or with Hamas in Gaza just a couple months ago, we see the wages of what happens whenever we fail to actively cultivate and pursue peace, and realize, at the namesake of your other employer, that what Ronald Reagan says, peace has to be achieved through strength. It has to be achieved through making those who are dissatisfied with the state of the world, with their lot in the world, who would upend that state of affairs through violence if necessary, to know they have no chance to succeed. And time and again, when we see the preservation of peace fail, it's almost always because of a failure of deterrence, of a failure to scare the bad guys straight. It's very costly once that happens, as we've seen in Ukraine over the last 2 years, you see in Gaza and Israel over the last 2 months or so. So I'm very hopeful that both those conflicts and other conflicts can be brought to a quick and satisfactory outcome. But at the same time, I think it's a lesson that here at the Institute of Peace we can always keep in mind as well, that it's not something that's just natural, not something that we enjoy without effort and time and resources.
Well, why don't we pick up there? And of course, the subject discussion tonight is October 7th and the war that broke out in Gaza after Hamas's attack on Israel. And curious to get your take on framing that war as Israel's 9/11. You, of course, served in the military after 9/11. I've written a book, in part reflecting on those who served and the impact. And I am curious if you think that is the right parallel for how America should think about what October 7th means to Israel and more broadly in the region. Is that a helpful construct?
Well, I mean, you could say that it's really 15 9/11s for Israel, given the small size of that nation and the number who lost their lives there. And I'd also say the immediate visceral impact on Israelis is probably even greater than what we experienced here in this country in 9/11 because of our size,
right,
both the number of people we have and the scale of our territory. There were plenty of people living in Arkansas, or for that matter, living in Washington State and Oregon or otherwise around the world who probably didn't have any immediate impact when those airplanes hit the tower or the Pentagon or Flight 93 went down. They didn't know anybody killed on it. They hadn't served with people who were at the NYPD or FDNY who went as first responders. They were appalled. They wanted vengeance. They wanted a sense of safety again. They might have been affected by it in years afterwards, whether they served in the military themselves or just had to live through some of the aftermath of the practices that we adopted in this country, like the TSA. That kind of pales in comparison, though, to what Israel experienced on October 7th. Again, because of its small size, both its small population, about 10 million, and geography, also because of its universal military service, there's almost no Israeli probably that wasn't immediately impacted by it, or at most 1 degree removed. If you didn't know someone or weren't related to someone who was murdered or maimed or kidnapped, you probably knew someone who knew someone. And then certainly you knew people who were immediately deployed in the war. And you see that ripple across Israel's society still very much so. So probably the impact it had was even more than the impact that 9/11 had on us. Now that said, I would say that the better comparison I think might be Pearl Harbor. Al-Qaeda was a terrorist group. It used very unconventional asymmetric methods of flying airplanes loaded with a lot of jet fuel into towers in the Pentagon. Hamas is a terrorist group. Hamas is also a governing entity as well. It has governing responsibility for territory, and just like Imperial Japan did, and it launched a surprise attack on another sovereign nation. And the response that we had to Pearl Harbor is probably a more apt response to what Israel has towards Gaza, or to Hamas governing Gaza, which is unconditional surrender. Now, unconditional surrender for a lot of the people of Hamas probably means they're going to get killed because they're not going to be surrendering anytime soon. But I would look at Pearl Harbor maybe is the more apt comparison. And I would say that what we did in Germany and Japan and the standards to which we held ourselves is the standards to which we should hold Israel, and nothing higher.
I want to get to that in a bit, because you're hitting on American policy and how we're engaging with Israeli leadership on that. But interesting, you referenced Pearl Harbor and the end state, always the strategist and thinking about the end of the conflict and where we go from here. Of course, Israel's articulated as destruction of Hamas. Love to get your take on, is it realizable? Do they have the right strategy in place to accomplish that? Here we are, plus 60 days plus into this conflict. It's nowhere seems to kind of suggest we're coming to a close. Tens of thousands, as reported by Hamas controlled entities in Gaza, killed. Rockets still being fired from Gaza into sovereign territory in Israel. Given their Israeli IDF objective, do you think it's something that can be achieved?
I do. I mean, some people say, oh, Hamas is an idea, an ideology, it can't be defeated. Hamas, as I said, is also a terrorist group and a governing entity. And it has all the hallmarks of a governing entity inside of Gaza. Why do they have this massive tunnel network? Why do you not see that elsewhere in the world? It's because elsewhere terrorist groups don't control the territory. They don't actually have sovereign control over it. They're not able to tunnel in hundreds of kilometers underneath their territory to protect themselves from retaliatory attacks. So Hamas can absolutely be destroyed as a governing entity and as a militant group. You know, its leaders can be killed or captured, its fighters can be killed or captured, its weapon caches can be destroyed, its tunnels can be flooded or destroyed. It absolutely can be destroyed. And I think Israel is on pace to doing that.
You know, going back to the 9/11 analogy, which of course is a great intelligence failure. You have the 9/11 Commission, others, Silverman Rod report in the United States studied that deeply because it missed the intel reporting. You're of course on the Intelligence Committee, but public reporting suggests that Israeli intelligence entities anticipated this, filed a report, knew this was coming. The policy or political leadership missed it, didn't pay attention to it. Are you surprised that Israel and with their technological prowess, their military prowess, missed something that clearly presented a huge threat, not just to their military, but to their people?
Well, I will say it was a failure. The government of Israel has acknowledged that as well. And they promised that there'll be a full accounting for that after the war is over, something that's commonplace in Israel, maybe less so than in many Western democracies. So I don't want to prejudge all the particular details about what that might ultimately find. I'll give some observations, though, just kind of common sense observations and not classified information that we've been briefed on or anything. As is often the case, I think part of the failure is going to be a failure of human intelligence, a failure to maintain the kind of network of agents inside of Gaza and inside Hamas that could alert Israel that certain factions inside of Hamas were taking very careful, deliberate steps to avoid electronic surveillance and detection, and they were up to no good. That is the case with many intelligence failures throughout history, and especially throughout modern history, and it seems to be accelerating in our lifetime. Is that you have voices that sit comfortably in places like Washington and say like, oh, well, we don't need to go to all the risk and all the danger and the potential for failure, failure to actually produce any intelligence, to develop spies in other countries. Like we can rely on whiz-bang technology, sitting in front of a computer in Washington, D.C. And that's true, you can do that for some things, and that's important. And there's some things that intelligence collection is very good at without human intelligence. I mean, there's only so long you can hide a satellite, or so long that you can hide, naval ships or missile sites. Electronic surveillance, satellite surveillance, very good for those things. But it's less good for the plans of what the bad guys are up to. There's a reason why intelligence professionals always say like, oh, plans and intentions of leaders are the hardest thing to get. It's like, yeah, they make it very hard to get it. Like Vladimir Putin is not on his iPhone. He's not on the computer. He's not on a computer. He's not surfing the web. The way he and others like him communicate make it very hard to have any clear insight into what they're thinking. However, you can oftentimes, especially for leaders of nation states, maybe not terrorist groups, you can often infer their plans fairly enough based on what they say publicly and what they commit their national resources to. So that's one thing. I think a failure of human intelligence and over-reliance, which our country is often guilty of as well, is technical or electronic surveillance and intelligence. A second failure, and again, this is a very common feature as well of intelligence failures, seems to be a failure of imagination. Right. You look at Yahya Sinwar, a man who has no doubt been plotting something like this for years, probably since he got out of that Israeli jail, maybe since he was put into the Israeli jail. In a sense, in some parts of Israeli society that maybe Hamas had moderated, maybe Hamas wanted to become a responsible governing authority in Gaza, or at least it was sufficiently deterred and it didn't want to risk the kind of punishing retaliatory war that Israel has launched now. It's the same failure you see with the Biden administration and their views on Iran and all of Iran's proxies. The idea, as it's sometimes called in the intelligent world, of mirror imaging, that these people want exactly what we want, they're exactly like we are. Maybe they're just misguided or even misunderstood. That's not the case. I mean, we should believe what they say, especially when they commit a lot of resources to it. I was in a Senate hearing recently and someone said, I wonder what the Houthis want. And my response was, well, their flag says death to Israel and death to Jews. Maybe we should take that seriously. So I think a failure of imagination about exactly what the bad guys are up to is probably at work here as well. And again, it's common throughout history. It's the way Western leaders underestimated the ambitions not only of Adolf Hitler but also of the Kaiser before World War I.
Just to press the point out, and then I want to definitely go to Iran. We can't have Senator Khan here without commenting on Iran here. But there was this notion of, I think, containment, that we could contain, that Israel could contain Hamas. And then you look what was going on geopolitically in the region. It was the Abraham Accords, right? And let's focus on what I think Prime Minister Netanyahu viewed as the existential threat to Tehran. That was seems to be a blind spot, but almost it was just got the strategy wrong, right? That this was some sort of a challenge that didn't need tending to, and clearly part of the tragedy since October 7th is that Likud leadership, frankly, took its eye off the ball. I'd love to get your reaction to that, and then talk about the resilience of the Abraham Accords, because you were quite involved and supportive of the Abraham Accords. And here we are 60 plus days into this conflict, and I'm curious to get your take, given all the tensions, regional, international, the diplomatic challenges, whether you see that framework holding in this environment.
I do see the Abraham Accords holding, and I do think at some point the momentum behind an expansion of them to other Arab nations will continue as well. The same strategic imperatives and logic that was driving that drove it back in 2019 and 2020 are still there, despite Hamas's atrocities against Israel. In some cases, you might say that's even more there. Furthermore, it's not like any of these Arab nations have any sympathy for Hamas. They view Hamas as one of the more armed militant offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood, which most of them have very little use for because it's a threat to their own people and to their own governments. So I do think the Abraham Accords, even if it doesn't happen on the time that one might have expected on October 6th, will remain solid, and they'll continue to grow as well. I do think that one of the reasons this attack happened on October 7th is because the Ayatollahs in Tehran were worried about that momentum, and they wanted to take steps to forestall it. That may not be the only reason, that may not be the main reason. I think time will tell as probably more Hamas leaders are captured and interrogated.
And here you're referencing the possibility of a Saudi-Israel deal, and that was...
Most particularly, yes.
Yeah.
Most particularly, but not just that, but most particularly. Again, as time will probably tell, and we'll get more insight into exactly what Hamas, the key decision makers inside of Hamas decided, like why did this happen on October 7th? Why didn't it happen last February? Why didn't it wait until next June or what have you? I do think that the momentum behind the Abraham's Accord was one reason. I mean, I think the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War was another reason. I mean, I remember waking up on the morning of October 7th and just seeing the initial headlines that were very incomplete. We now sadly know about significant rocket and missile attacks from Gaza. And my immediate reaction was, this is Tehran letting their dog off the chain to try to disrupt the momentum of the Abraham Accord discussions. Obviously, when the full scale of the atrocities became clear throughout the day later, it was something more than that, but I do think that was part of it.
So we were talking about deterrence, and there's definitely a story here of the erosion of deterrence overall. But if you look in the north of Israel, there is this focus, and we've had skirmishes across the border, but it's escalated, but not to the point where I think either side would call it a northern front has opened up between Hezbollah and Israel. So want to get your take on that, and perhaps focus on two. Does that surprise you? I mean, you surprised given where Tehran perhaps wants to go? That would perhaps be the next place to go to unleash chaos. And second, the United States has been most active from a military standpoint, at least publicly, on this front, sending in one, at times two carrier strike groups to deter. We'll get to the Houthis in Yemen who've introduced themselves into this conflict in a moment. But I'd love to get your take on how you see Hezbollah and overall what has or has not happened in the northern front.
Well, the people who live in northern Israel have had to be evacuated from it, probably don't view it as a very limited conflict right now. And I think there's a big question whether any Israeli government in the future, whether it's from the far left to the far right, can accept a world in which Jews are not welcome to live on the northern border of Israel, or for that matter on the southern border of Israel. I mean, that in a way kind of cedes one of the key points of Zionism, that Jews should be able to live safely in their homeland and not just in Tel Aviv or Haifa, but in Sderot or in northern Israel as well. So I think it's an open question whether, and the reason why it would be an open question for Israeli governments from the far left to the far right is whether the people of Israel will ever accept basically the fact that there might be no-go zones inside their country. I think at the moment probably Israel would like to finish the war against Hamas in Gaza before a new full front opens up, even if there's some fighting against Hezbollah or against attacks originating from Yemen and Syria. I suspect as well that Hezbollah may have concerns as well about opening up an entire new front. I remember Hassan Nasrallah famously said after the 2006 war that if he had known Israel was going to respond the way it did, he wouldn't have launched it in the first place. And then finally there's Iran. I mean, Hezbollah's rockets and missiles, which dwarf Hamas's, it's kind of like Iran's gun at the temple to Israel. And if they pull that gun, then they don't have that gun anymore. So deterrence for them at that point would depend solely on Iran, and Israel would not only have no reason not to go for the jugular against Hezbollah, they wouldn't have no reason not to go for the jugular, or at least go for significant retaliatory strikes against Iran itself.
Yeah, I mean,
Hezbollah is already attacked.
But Hezbollah, you mentioned it's like reported over 150,000, more sophisticated. It's not just rockets, it's missiles, and it's not just northern Israel, right? I mean, their ranges extend way beyond.
All of Israel. Yeah, right now it's limited to certain zones inside northern Israel, but all of Israel. But I think Iran sees Hezbollah as its main deterrent to Israel against strikes on Iran itself or on its personnel or facilities throughout the Middle East.
So I want to talk shift slightly to the U.S.'s response and kind of the regional issues that have emerged. To date, reporting 78 attacks on U.S. forces from October 1760. U.S. servicemen injured, either Iraq or Syria. My understanding of the Biden administration is they don't in any way connect this to October 7th, at least publicly stating it as such. You were on Fox News Sunday not too long ago calling for a quote-unquote massive retaliation and would target the Iranians who are operating in Iraq and Syria. There's been some response from the administration. I don't think anybody would accuse them of responding massively, retaliating massively. Give me your take on how you would address this and the nexus, if at all, between the targeting of U.S. forces by these, some at least, Iranian proxies on U.S. forces in Iraq and in Syria.
Well, I mean, I think it goes without saying that Iran is not scared of the United States. You know, their leaders are not scared of Joe Biden. And I just want to make this point. That's not, you know, policy argument. That's not partisan jousting. That's not an opinion. That is a fact. We have responded to their attacks on several occasions only to have more attacks. That's by definition the failure of deterrence. And we just saw it again this weekend, escalating even further, now attacks directly on our embassy compound in Baghdad.
Right.
And I think your question may be a little dated, because I think it's a lot more than 78 attacks since October 7th, to go along with the 80 attacks from the time the president took office to up till October 7th. Iran has had a proxy strategy for over 30 years now. They've built up, in some cases created, and funded and trained and armed and equipped groups like Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah and the Houthis in Yemen and paramilitary groups in Iraq and Syria. Those groups attack Americans. When we don't respond, it's really bad, but when we respond only by striking proxies, especially empty proxy warehouses, all we do is validate Iran's proxy strategy. Like when we blow up a weapons cache of a paramilitary group in Syria, in Tehran, they're high-fiving. Like, see, it works. They're not going to hold us accountable for all this. When we all know, and even senior administration officials admit publicly and on the record, that Iran is accountable for all these attacks. So if you want the attacks to stop, you have to attack something that Iran holds dear itself. Like President Trump did when he killed Iran's terrorist mastermind, Qasem Soleimani, in Iraq in 2020. Or maybe a more apt analogy is what Ronald Reagan did in 1986 after Libyan-backed terrorists blew up a nightclub in Berlin frequented by American service members. He almost killed Muammar Gaddafi and blew up much of their military infrastructure in Libya. Or maybe most apt is what Ronald Reagan did in the tanker wars in 1987 and 1988. Iran was, in part of its war with Iraq, was mining the Persian Gulf. That was causing big problems for lots of reasons. We flagged tankers with American flags, which we almost never do, so our Navy could escort them. Ultimately, one of those tankers hit an Iranian mine. Reagan blew up a couple of oil platforms. The next day, he walked just a couple blocks from here. He walked out to Marine One on the South Lawn. Reporter said, "Are we at war with Iran now?" And he said, "No, we're not at war with Iran. They wouldn't be stupid enough to go to war with us." And he basically was right about that. But about 6 months later, I guess they'd forgotten the message. One of their mines blew up an actual American naval vessel, and then he sank half of their Navy. And then they stopped mining the Persian Gulf. And in fact, just like 6 months later, the Iran-Iraq war was over because they were afraid that what Ronald Reagan would do next, maybe side fully with Iraq in that war. So if you want the attacks on our troops to stop, if you want to prevent a mass casualty attack, which I'm afraid is going to happen soon, you have to take firm and decisive action against what Iran holds most dear. Its key leaders running around the region, promoting and supporting these groups, or its military facilities, ships, aircraft, refineries, something critical that Iran does not want to lose. Only then is Iran going to pull in its horns.
So short of having the Biden administration adopt the quote-unquote Reagan approach to the Gulf, you've been taking some action in the Congress. I wonder if you would expand upon it, because you know the line between certainly what Israel's enduring with the continued rocket attacks on its sovereign territory. We're talking about Hezbollah's arsenal, the attacks on U.S. forces in Syria and Iraq, and then of course with the Houthis, which have shown pretty sophisticated stuff.
Yeah.
You know, it's coming from Iran, providing these capabilities to their proxies, and you put forward the No ICMs or Drones for Iran Act. Seems like a good idea. Give us a sense of the prospect of that, and of course, is tied, I think, to what lapsed in terms of Iran-related sanctions and came out of the JCPOA.
Well, don't forget that those Iranian missiles and drones are also going to Russia to attack innocent civilians in Ukraine as well. It is, October, I think it was October 18th, round about then, that another deadline from the failed Iran nuclear deal passed, and it was the sunsetting of international multilateral sanctions on Iran's missile program. So imagine that, like 11 days after the attack by Hamas in Israel, we allowed sanctions on Iran's missile programs to expire. Again, just because President Biden and those around him, who were those same people around Barack Obama, are so invested in the failed Iran nuclear deal. It's just one example of how there really has not been a single bit of change in our Iran policy from October 6th. It's like the attack never happened as it relates to Iran and how we're interacting with Iran and our policy towards the country.
We've got a couple more minutes here and want to hit on two more items. First, going back to U.S. policy as it relates to Israel, we recently had Secretary of Defense speak at the Reagan National Defense Forum, and his comments were bookended in terms as it relates to the Gaza war, with strong support for Israel on both ends. But in between, you had a lot of language in terms of U.S. And his role in speaking to Israelis, pressing the Israelis, those are his words, to protect civilians and to ensure the robust flow of humanitarian aid. He said, quote, "I have personally pushed Israeli leaders to avoid civilian casualties and to shun irresponsible rhetoric and to prevent violence by settlers in West Bank and to dramatically expand access to humanitarian aid." He was celebrated in some corners for that language, and then criticized in others for being kind of making public the sorts of feedback that you would expect allies to give to one another, behind closed doors. What's your view in terms of what Israel has done vis-a-vis protecting civilians as it carries out its campaign to destroy Hamas?
I mean, count me as a critic of Secretary Austin's statement there. The last thing Israel needs is patronizing lectures about the laws of war or civilian casualties. Israel goes far above and beyond its requirements under the laws of war to try to minimize civilian casualties. That's hard to do when Hamas is hiding in hospitals and schools and residential areas. It's hard to do when they're holding hostages so they won't be attacked. I mean, Hamas is to blame for civilian casualties because they didn't just commit war crimes on October 7th, they continue to commit them every single day, in addition to firing rockets and missiles indiscriminately into Israel. And I would just go back again to what I said, that October 7th is more akin to Pearl Harbor. Like, we were not wringing our hands about civilian casualties in Germany and Japan in the 1940s. We killed over 100,000 Japanese on the night of March 9th and 10th, 1945, in the firebombing of Tokyo. That was not a nuclear weapon. 100,000 in a single night. Israel goes above and beyond its requirements. I don't remember in Iraq or Afghanistan us sending text messages to civilians in neighborhoods about an attack coming in, which obviously will get to Hamas. I don't remember dropping leaflets telling people where to go. In fact, as recently as the Battle of Mosul, there wasn't much of that going on. So I think Israel should be commended for what it does to try to avoid civilian casualties. They don't need patronizing lectures from Joe Biden or his cabinet.
All right, let's move to one other item, which we've had a chance to speak about in the past, but so central to this discussion, but somehow does not get the consistent attention I think it merits. 30 Americans were killed on October 7th. There remains 8 American hostages, as far as we know, in Gaza, being held by Hamas or other terrorist organizations. 2 questions. To what extent, because of that alone, does this make this war America's war? And 2, what are we not doing that we should be doing to free American hostages? And I'll just note, we talk about 444 days.
Yeah.
We all know that references the number of days you had American hostages in Tehran. Most Americans wouldn't understand what 65 means, which I believe is the number of days since we've had Americans held hostage.
Yeah. I mean, I think it may be the worst terror attack in terms of American Americans killed since 9/11 itself. And the administration seems to overlook that they don't make much of it publicly in terms of what we're going to do to respond. I've said that we have, in the last 2 months, we have specially trained forces in our military who are specifically prepared to go in for hostage rescue. We need to make those available if it would help Israel. Now, Israel has control of the authority of Gaza. We wouldn't go in unilaterally. But if we have an opportunity to help Israel to get back not just its own citizens, but our citizens and our special operations forces who are specifically trained in hostage rescue, then of course we should make them available. And also from the very beginning, President Biden should have been much more forceful, not just with Hamas and their political leadership in their $1 million condos in Doha, but also with Tehran about what would happen if Americans weren't released. But apparently, the leadership of Hamas fears the Philippines and Thailand more than they fear the United States of America, since those nations got their hostages back.
Well, I want to pursue that point. I mean, I've heard you say that elsewhere. I mean, if you look at the raw numbers, Hamas has released Israelis to Israel, the mortal enemy. You mentioned the international workers who have been released, Russians who have been released, yet U.S. citizens have not. Certainly, you've had 3, I believe. What more can be done? Obviously, there's the military option, but for the reasons you've outlined, it's complex. What else can the United States do on that front?
Well, I mean, I think that's one of the fundamental things to do. I mean, there's a reason why the hostages got released the day Ronald Reagan took office. And I know some people who apologize for the Carter administration say, well, that's not the case. I mean, look, the Ayatollahs are not afraid of Jimmy Carter. They were afraid of Ronald Reagan. And right now, the Hamas and their masters in Tehran are simply not afraid of Joe Biden. That's why Americans haven't been released. I bet they are afraid of Vladimir Putin.
All right, last question. And really thank you, Senator, for the time. There's some work for Congress to do. There is pending before the Congress a supplemental, which includes funding for Ukraine. President Zelensky is in town. I believe he's meeting with senators, if he didn't do it today, tomorrow. And also funding for Israel. It's all in one package, as well as some other funding items. You're a newsmaker here at the United States Institute of Peace. Do you want to make some news and tell us when that funding package will go through and we could all join in your festive attire here and celebrate congressional support?
I do not foresee it passing this month before Congress recesses. For
I said festive, Senator. That's not festive.
So the president proposed legislation that would address four different issues: Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, and our border. And Republicans have insisted from the very beginning that we have credible and serious changes to border policy, which is allowing a total crisis there. Just to stress how big a crisis it is, there were several days last week when 12,000 illegal migrants entered our country across the border, 12,000. To put that in perspective, Jay Johnson, who was Barack Obama's Secretary of Homeland Security, said that 1,000 would overload the system. 1,000. Or to put it in a different way, in 1 week at that rate, the number of illegal migrants who cross in this country would become like the 4th or 5th largest city in Arkansas. And thus far, the Democrats simply have not been serious about negotiating for the kind of genuine changes to policy that would help us secure our border again, mostly on asylum and parole. And until that happens, I don't see the legislation passing as a whole. Now, I support all parts of it. I support Ukraine. I don't support Joe Biden's Ukraine policy. Of course, I support Israel. I think we need to strengthen our defenses in the Western Pacific and help Taiwan do the same. And of course, I want to solve the crisis at our border. I'm happy to pass it all in one package. I'm happy to pass it in more than one bill. But we have to make sure that Joe Biden cares as much about our border as he cares about another nation's border. And right now, he just doesn't seem to do so.
Guess we'll have to wait till after Christmas for that gift. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Senator Cotton for being here at USIP for our Newsmaker series. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Roger.